The snow fell light that morning, drifting slow like ash over the campfires of a restless army. Robb Stark stood outside his tent, bare-handed in the cold. The chill bit into his skin, but it cleared his thoughts, and he needed that more than comfort. Letters had arrived. 3 of them manned, none bore good tidings. From Riverrun, his uncle Edmure wrote in worry, speaking of whispers in the Riverlands, of lords once sworn beginning to waver in their loyalty. From the Neck, Lord Howland Red warned of movement in the south. Tywin Lannister was mustering men in the Westerlands. And the 3rd letter, that was the worst, from Lady Catelyn, still mourning, still pleading, do not forget the phrase. Robb, do not dishonor them, not after all we've lost. He had already dishonored them. Robb's jaw clenched as he stared into the dying fire, its coals dimming like his patience. He hadn't meant to break his vow to Walder Frey, but love had changed him. Jane had soothed his pain, when nothing else could. Not his victories, not the praise, not the songs sung in his name. But now he was reaping the price of that decision. Roose Bolton had grown colder in council, more calculating, eyes always watching. The Karstarks, still raw from Lord Rickard's execution, were loyal in name only. The Riverlords respected him, but did not love him, and worse, they didn't fear him. And that, Robb realized, had to change. So that morning, as snow blanketed the camp, he summoned his bannermen, not just to discuss tactics, but to change the very fabric of their war. The North cannot fight alone, he began, voice hard and clipped, and the Riverlands cannot win without the North. We've marched, we've bled, we've won, but we are still separate, still fractured. He looked to the Blackfish. First, his uncle Brynden, who gave him a curt nod. We bind them together. A new pact, stronger than old oaths. The Riverlands and the North One Kingdom, united now. A murmur ran through the tent. Great John Umber frowned. That sounds like talk fit for after the war, not during it. Then we'll never make it to after, Robb snapped. The Lannisters are moving. We wait, we die. I want an army that moves like one beast, not 2 hounds on separate leashes. Roose Bolton raised an eyebrow. And how do you propose to convince Lord Tully and his vassals to kneel to a northern king? Robb stepped aside, revealing Jane standing behind him in the shadows of the tent. They won't kneel, he said. They'll marry. Lady Jane Westerling of the Crag is no longer queen only by love. She is now Lady of Riverrun by decree. Even the Blackfish blinked at that. You mean to make her Edmure's heir? I mean to give the Riverlands a reason to call her their own, a bloodline tied to their soil, and a reason to fight with us, not behind us. It was radical, risky, possibly blasphemous in the eyes of the old gods, but Robb Stark wasn't a boy anymore, and boys didn't win wars. By the week's end, a new banner was stitched. The direwolf of House Stark running through the rippling trout of House Tully. 2 sigils merged as one. It flew above Riverrun, it flew above the camps. And when word spread across Westeros, it did not come quietly. Some in the south laughed, calling Robb's move desperate, but others saw it for what it was, a statement. A kingdom was rising in the north and east, and it was preparing to drown the lion in its own blood. The ravens flew faster than men, could march, and within days of the new banner rising above Riverrun, the south stirred with alarm. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister's nails dug half-moons into her palms as she read the report. A kingdom. He dares call himself a king again. And worse, he's made that Riverlander girl a queen. Her brother, Tyrion, ever the calm. In her storm, looked up from his wine. Not just a queen, a symbol. Robb Stark isn't just fighting us now, he's giving the Riverlands something to believe in. Something that doesn't wear gold. He broke his oath to the phrase. She spat. Walder won't stand for it. Walder Frey stands for whatever keeps his brood fed and feared, Tyrion muttered. And right now, he's watching. Which way the wind blows. If Stark can unite the North and the Riverlands, he might just blow the rest of our allies away. Tywin Lannister, their father, sat in the corner reading the same letter in silence. Then, folding it neatly, he spoke. In that cold, final voice of his, we invite the Freys to dinner. Back in the Riverlands, Robb's transformation from war leader to ruler was swift. No longer just a boy draped in wolfskin armor, he held courts beside Jane at Riverrun, receiving riverlords who once looked at him as a stranger. Lord Jason Mallister swore fealty first grudgingly, but without resistance. The Blackwoods and Bracken's enemies for generations stood side by side before the Stark throne. In truth, they weren't swearing to a boy. They were swearing to a cause. A new kingdom that could finally hold the Lannisters accountable. Yet not everyone welcomed the change. I served your father, said Lord Vance of Atranta, voice heavy with distrust. I bled for him, but this is not the North. This is something else. Robb looked him square in the eyes. My father believed in duty, in justice. He died for it. I won't ask you to die for me, only to stand with me, because if we fall together, and the lions will dance on both. Our graves. It wasn't a royal speech, but it was honest, and that, for many, was enough. In the woods beyond Harrenhal, the Brotherhood without banners watched the shift in power with quiet curiosity. Beric Dondarrion, still flickering with unnatural life, whispered to Thuros, perhaps we're no longer the only fire in the dark. And in the Vale, young Lord Robin Arryn clutched his dolls, while Petyr Baelish read reports with a crooked smile. Ambitious, isn't he? Our young wolf grows fangs. But even as the North and Riverlands united, shadows gathered. Roose Bolton remained at Robb's side, but his eyes had grown colder, his words more distant. He's binding strangers to our cause, Bolton told his bastard, Ramsay, in a Ravendil-livered letter. The boy forgets what makes the North. Strong fear, loyalty born from the heart is a poor shield against Lannister steel. Ramsay replied with a grin no parchment could contain. Shall I make them remember, father? And far to the south, Walder Frey listened as emissaries from King's Landing whispered gold and vengeance into his ears. They mock your house. One said, you gave your daughter, and they gave you shame. Let us help you fix that. A wedding, a feast, and a reckoning. Robb knew he was being watched. He could feel it in every council meeting, in every glance exchanged between lords. Some smiled too quickly, some whispered too much, but he pressed on. His next move wasn't political. It was military. We march for Harrenhal, he told. His commanders, it's the heart of the Riverlands. We take it, we show every doubter what our kingdom means, and we remind the lions we are not prey. The Blackfish nodded, but Jay, never wiser than he expected, took his hand later. That night, her voice soft. Don't mistake unity for loyalty, Robb. They follow you now. But if you fall, they won't just scatter. They'll tear each other apart. He kissed her hand. Then I won't fall. Outside their chamber, the merged banner of Stark and Tully whipped in the wind, heavy with meaning, winter and water, tied as one. But both could drown a man just as easily as protect him, and the storm had only just begun. The march to Harrenhal was hard, even for soldiers seasoned by years of war. The Riverlands were still bleeding, fields blackened by fire and homes abandoned, ghosts clinging to every tree. Robb rode at the front with grey wind padding silently. Beside him, the direwolf's golden eyes sweeping the road like a second commander. Behind him came the northern bannermen lords, grim and stoic-hand, the Riverlanders, more varied, more volatile. The merged army moved like a new creature, not yet accustomed to its limbs, but dangerous all the same. At night, around the campfires, old grudges began to surface. Stark men muttered about the softness of Riverland tactics. Tully men scoffed at the North's bluntness, their disdain barely masked. Fistfights broke out. One man lost an eye. Another lost his hand to a sword. Robb summoned both leaders, the Umbers and the Blackwoods, and made them kneel in the dirt before the entire camp. "You bleed each other, and you do the lion's work for him," he growled. "The next time I see one of you draw steel against your own, I'll have your heads, lord or no." The silence that followed was not respect, it was fear, and for once Robb welcomed it. Harrenhal loomed days later, massive, cursed, and quiet. Smoke still curled from its broken towers, and the iron gate hung half-shattered. Gregor Clegane had abandoned it in chaos months before, leaving only ruins and terror behind. But it was not empty. The gates opened before Robb's army arrived, and from within walked a small party of men draped in dark cloaks and brown leathers. At their head stood Lord Vargohote, twisted smile stretching wide across a scarred face. "We kept it warm. For you, King Robb," he lisped, his accent thick and unpleasant. "Though I doubt you'll like the stench. Lannisters make terrible house guests." Robb didn't smile. "You held this in my name. In your queen's name, perhaps," Vargo answered with a slimy grin. "The Westerlings and I have history." Jane's hand tightened on her horse's reins, but she said nothing. Robb dismounted without a word and walked through the crumbling gates, grey wind beside him, his bannermen in cautious step. Inside, Harrenhal was worse than he. Remembered, charred bones in hallways, chains hanging from rafters. Rats as large as dogs darted between stone tiles soaked in old blood. The mountain had left more than wreckage had left madness behind. Still, Robb claimed it. From Harrenhal, he sent out new Raven's orders, declarations, threats. The Riverlands were now his kingdom, and the old bloodlines would be reshaped under his rule. New banners were issued. Castles left leaderless were reassigned. And for the first time in weeks, the war shifted from defense to offense. The kingdom of winter and water was no longer just reacting, it was reaching. But in the south, reactions came fast and fatal. Lord Tywin Lannister had not wasted the delay. While Robb was forging kingdoms and giving speeches, Tywin was cutting deals. A raven flew to the twins, another to the Reach, one to Dawn. Promises of gold, of revenge, of recognition. And then he sent a final raven to Lord Walder Freywyth. Only 6 words. The wolf broke bread, then vows. It was enough. Walder Frey called his banners, quietly, secretly, not against Robb, not yet. But his cooks sharpened knives, his sons drilled in the yard, and the twins' gates creaked open just enough for Lannister gold to slip through. Robb, unaware of the blood already pooling behind his back, stood atop the battlements of Harrenhal, with Lord Bolton beside him. "The war is changing," Robb said. "Tywin won't come to us, not while we're strong." Roose looked out over the army forming tents in the field below. "Strength makes men desperate," he said softly. "Desperation makes them unpredictable. Let them come. Let them panic. I want them scared." Bolton turned his pale eyes on the young king. "And what of your bannermen? Are they not desperate too? What scares them, I wonder?" Robb stared ahead. "Me, I hope." But Robb Stark wasn't the only wolf people feared anymore. In the Dreadfort, Ramsay Bolton read his father's letter and laughed until tears ran down his cheeks. The wolf thinks he's king now. Shall we remind him where real fear lives? He turned to the prisoner in the corner, the broken man once called Theon Greyjoy, and whispered, "Time to go hunting." The Riverlands never stayed still for long. The same rivers that gave them life also carved their history in chaos. Raids, fires, shifting loyalties had always been a passing storm. But under Robb Stark, something had begun to change. For the first time in years, the roads were patrolled. Thieves were hanged, not bargained with. Broken bridges were rebuilt. Small folk whispered that the young wolf was not just a warlord, he was a king. One they could follow, one they could fear. Yet the deeper Robb's forces moved into the Riverlands, the more they began to feel the weight of their own momentum. Harrenhal had become both stronghold and symbol, but it was a symbol that needed defending. It drew attention to much of it. Spies came, cloaked as merchants. Messengers disappeared between towns. One lord's cousin was found nailed to a tree with his eyes torn out and the word Kingslayer carved into his chest. Robb's war was no longer just against the Lannisters. It was against shadows. At Riverrun, Queen Jane sat in her chambers, surrounded by whispers. The Riverlord's wives and daughters fawned over her in public, but behind closed doors, the daggers came out. She's no Tully. She's a Westerling, barely noble, bought her crown with her womb. She endured the gossip with grace, but even she couldn't ignore the message left in her sewing basket, one of her wedding ribbons soaked in lamb's blood, tied in a perfect noose. She didn't show it to Robb, she burned it. But that night, she placed her hand on her stomach and whispered, "We will not die easily, little one. Not you, not me." At Harrenhal, Robb met again with his war council. "Tywin won't strike head-on," said Brynden Tully, tapping his finger on the map. "He'll bleed us. Use the phrase, use the Riverland turncoats. Starve us of trust before he sends swords." "The phrase won't dare," argued Greyjoy Umber. "They've tied their name to ours, whether they like it or not." Roose Bolton said nothing. He watched. Then Robb leaned over the map, placing a dagger on Seaguard. "We take this port. It cuts off their sea trade. We'll send Galbart, Glover with ships up the coast. They won't expect a naval assault." "You're spreading yourself thin," Bolton finally said. "Divide your men, and you invite ambush." "We need results," Robb answered coldly. "The lords are growing restless. They want victory, not walls and waiting." He didn't say what he truly feared, that all of this, the new kingdom, the banners, the loyalty, was paper-thin, and the fire was already licking at the edges. In the Twins, Walder Frey sat at the head of his table, surrounded by sons, grandsons, and whispering Lannister messengers. "They all forget who built this bridge," he croaked, spittle flying from his lips. "Without me, the young wolf would still be frozen at the neck." "He's made you look weak," said one of his sons. "Calls himself king, but won't even answer your letters. He marries some up-jumped Westerling girl while our daughter sits discarded," hissed another. Walder raised a bony hand. "Then we remind him who holds the Riverlands together. He smiled, yellow teeth like broken corn. We invite him back. A wedding, a truce, a celebration, just long enough for a reckoning. Back at Harrenhal, Robb received the Raven, a wedding proposal. Edmure Tully to Rosalind Frey, an alliance to mend the broken vow. The blackfish bristled. You think Walder Frey forgives that easily? Robb shook his head. No, but he's offering a path forward. We can't keep bleeding allies. Jane said nothing. She stood in the corner, her face unreadable. Later that night, Robb found her alone in the Godswood garden. No heart tree here, but a hollow stump that seemed just as sacred. Do you think I'm a fool for going? He asked. No, she said, but I fear you're walking into a place where honor is a knife. He kissed her hand. I'll be careful. Be a king, she whispered. Not a son trying to make peace for a father who can't forgive you. The Freys prepared. The Lannisters waited. And in the Dreadfort, Ramsay Snow rode through the snow-slicked woods with a sack tied to his saddle. Inside it, Theon Greyjoy barely breathed, his mind shattered, his name stripped. He was no longer heir to the Iron Islands. He was Reek now, and Ramsay had plans for him. The North remembers, he whispered as they rode. Let's make sure it remembers the wrong things. The march to the Twins was tense, slower than Robb wanted, quieter than it should have been. Too quiet. The usual jesting among the ranks had dried up, replaced by caution and long stares. Men felt it, even if they didn't say it. The air hung, too heavy, the birds too silent. The trees seemed to lean in, listening. Catelyn rode beside her son, cloaked in silence and grief. She'd insisted on coming the moment the Raven arrived with Walder Frey's proposal. I know his face, she'd told Robb, and I know his pride. He may open his gates, but he won't open his heart. Robb had nodded. He didn't need reminding that he'd broken a vow. And worse, he had no illusions that the Freys forgave freely. Still, a wedding, a chance to repair. It was the path his father would have taken. The honorable one, and perhaps the most dangerous. The gates of the Twins creaked open with practiced hospitality, to practiced inside. Lord Walder Frey greeted them with a smirk stretched tight across his leathery face. King Robb he rasped, bowing just deep enough to not offend. And Lady Catelyn, and your queen. He looked at Jane as if she were a fruit bruised from market. I suppose congratulations are in order. Though not for me, of course. I've always found marriage to be an unnecessary entanglement. Jane said nothing. Catelyn's hand twitched on her saddle. Walder stepped back, arms wide. But tonight is not about old grudges. It's about new ties, Edmure. Rosalind. A pretty match, wouldn't you agree? Rosalind Frey stood like a shadow behind her father, eyes red-rimmed, trembling. Edmure, ever the optimist, smiled despite the cold around him. The wedding feast began. The hall was lit with hundreds of candles, the air thick with roast meats, sweet wine, and forced laughter. Music swelled, wine flowed, and the guards so. Many guards lined the walls with smiles too tight and eyes too alert. Robb drank sparingly. Catelyn not at all. Every moment she scanned the room. Something was wrong. The musicians were off-key. The guards never shifted. And Rosalind was crying during her own wedding dance. Then came the door. It slammed shut. The music stopped, and the first arrow flew. It struck Edmure's arm as he danced, the second piercing a stark bannerman in the throat. Chaos exploded in the hall. Screams drowned the strings. as crossbow bolts rained from the balconies. Frey men drew swords from beneath tablecloths. Traitors, Catelyn screamed, knocking over her chair as she dove for Robb. But the young wolf was already moving. Grey wind bursting into the hall from the courtyard with a howl that split the air. He tore through the nearest Frey guard, jaws snapping, blood spraying. More bolts flew, some hitting friend, some hitting foe, but Robb ducked beneath the table, grabbed a fallen shield, and barked orders through the madness. Get Jane out. Find Edmure. Protect the Queen. Catelyn found Lord Frey cackling behind his table, untouched, wine in hand. You think you're gods, he hissed. But I built these halls. I gave you crossing, and you gave me shame. Catelyn lunged, a dagger in hand. She reached him, slashed his cheek, but then came the blade. Not from Frey, from behind, from Roose Bolton. It plunged into her back with precision, deep and merciless. She gasped, eyes wide, staring not at her killer but at her son. Roose whispered into her ear, the North remembers, but I rewrite its memory. Robb, bloodied and burning, turned just in time to see his mother fall. He roared, a sound more beast than man, and charged toward Herb, but Roose caught him first. Their swords clashed for one furious heartbeat, but it was enough. Grey wind tackled Bolton, ripping into his arm, buying Robb seconds. Jane. Robb shouted, "Run!" She hesitated, but then obeyed, fleeing through the servants' corridor to Stark guards at her side. Robb turned back to Roose, ready to finish it, but a bolt struck Grey wind in the side. Then another. The direwolf wind staggered, then dropped. Robb screamed. Another arrow hit his leg. A third lodged in his shoulder. He dropped to one knee. Roose rose, blood pouring from his shredded arm. Now, he said to the guards, make the king remember. Outside, the twins' screams echoed into the night. But some men survived. The Blackfish, who had slipped out to relieve himself before the attack, returned to a massacre and vanished into the darkness. Galbart Glover escaped with a score of men. One of Jane's guards carried her bleeding through the woods. The North and Riverlands wept that night, but Robb Stark was not dead, not yet, not while breath clawed at his chest and his blade still tasted blood. And in the dark corners of Westeros, old loyalties began to shift. The lion had struck, but the wolf was not done, not if the survivors had anything to say about it. The halls of the twins stank of blood and piss by dawn. The bodies of Stark men, Tully knights, and Frey traitors lay scattered in pools of wine and gore. But deep in the cellars, far below the feasting floors, Robb Stark breathed, barely. Roose Bolton had spared him, not out of mercy but calculation. You'll die when it matters most, he'd whispered, before ordering his men to chain Robb to the stone. Now, the young wolf hung from iron cuffs, his wounds barely bandaged, his strength bleeding into the cold. He drifted between rage and memory, his mother's final scream, Grey Wind's whimper, Jane's face vanishing into smoke. But rage didn't die in a Stark so easily, and vengeance was louder than death. Jane Westerling didn't run far. She rode until her thighs bled, and her guard dropped dead beside her. Then she walked, cloak-soaked, feet cracked, until she reached a fishing village untouched by war. They gave her shelter, food, a bed. They didn't know she was queen, but the raven she sent did. It found its way to White Harbour, into the hands of Wyman Manderley, a man who had lost 2 sons and most of his patience. And when he read her, Words, the king lives. The north bleeds. I beg you, rise. He did not hesitate. Across the north, fires were lit, not for warmth, but for signal. The Boltons thought they had secured the north with whispers and dread, but they hadn't seen the rage simmering beneath the snow. In Deepwood Motte, House Glover began arming again. In Bear Island, the Mormonts painted war over their sigils. In the hills of the Flint Cliffs, the mountain clans began sharpening axes. And in the Neck, Howland Reed whispered to the trees and rallied warriors not seen in generations. The North remembered, but now it was ready to act. Roose Bolton returned to the Dreadfort with blood on his cloak and lies in his mouth. He told the lords that Robb had died at the Twins, that Catelyn was gone, that the North was at peace under his rule and the blessing of the Iron Throne. And for a while the lie held, until heads began disappearing from spikes, until Frey caravans burned on the road, until a banner reappeared in the trees, one the Lannisters had believed destroyed. The direwolf torn, yes, but not dead. Robb Stark didn't die in the Twins. The Maester who was supposed to finish him lost a hand to a chain wolf's fury. Robb's last act before collapsing. He was rescued 3 nights later by men loyal to the Blackfish, who had tracked the chaos, bribed a Frey guard, and carried their king out wrapped in hay and silence. For weeks, Robb drifted in fever, but when he woke, under the stars, near the edge of the Trident, he remembered everything. And he remembered who he now had to be, not just a king, a symbol, a ghost returned from the dead. They called him the Wraith of the River after that. He didn't ride at the front of armies anymore. He appeared at night, flanked by survivors, and wolves, cutting down Frey patrols, burning their banners, leaving only one message etched in blood on their gates: the king lives. By the year's end, the war had changed shape. It was no longer North versus South, no longer honor versus treachery. Now it was fury versus fire. House Frey began to crumble. Sons turned on fathers. Allies vanished. Edmure Tully, freed in a nighttime raid, began rallying riverlords once more. Even among the Lannisters, unease grew. Jaime began to question the cost. Cersei doubled her wine. Tywin, he began fortifying the Rock, because he knew he had not killed a wolf. He had created a legend. Robb Stark, the king of winter and water, no longer sought thrones or banners. He sought justice. He no longer trusted oaths or allies, only action. And as the snows fell thicker across the Riverlands, the people looked not to King's Landing, but to the misty banks of the Trident, where a ghost king gathered strength. And they whispered the lion drowned, but the wolf learned to swim.